Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to take this opportunity to welcome everyone to this meeting today. My name is Vinolia. I'm the Marketing and Event Coordinator for ISCA. Today, this is actually our 10th live session for the RSWS for this year, 2022. And I would like to appreciate everyone who made it an effort to be here today. And without any waste of time, I'm just going to take you through some housekeeping rules. As you all know, every house has some rules, so we need to adhere to the rules and make sure that our house is in order. Without any waste of time, first of all, we do have our speaker, who is Dr. Emilia Vann Yaroson. So for those who always attend our sessions, you do all know that you have to mute yourself once you enter the session to avoid any background noise. And also, for those who have questions during the session, please write them in the chat box, and then they will be attended after the presentation. If you'd like to present your own question, wait for the speaker to finish their presentation, and then you will raise your hand and be given the opportunity to present your own question to the speaker. Without any waste of time, today we do have our speaker, who is Dr. Emilia Vann Yaroson, who is a lecturer in operations and analytics within the University of Huddersfield Business School. She acquired her bachelor's and master's degree from Ahmadu Bello University and the University of Greenwich, and PhD from the University of Bradford. She also received a postgraduate diploma in research method from the University of Bradford and additional training in health system strengthening and pharmaceutical supply chain from the University of Melbourne and UNICEF. Before joining the University of Huddersfield, she worked at the University of Bradford and at Liverpool Hope University. She was also a visiting research fellow at the University of Malta. Before she joined the academia, she worked for several years in the banking industry and as a logistic manager at Country Cargo Logistics Solutions. Her research interests include managing medicine, supply chains operations, artificial intelligence, green logistics, and circular economy. She has published several peer-reviewed articles, book chapters, and has presented her research in various conferences. I would like to take this opportunity to welcome amongst us Dr. Emilia Vann Yaroson. You can feel free to do your presentation, and also please don't forget to share your screen for us. Thank you. You can take over.
Hello, thank you, Vinolia, for that wonderful introduction.
You are welcome.
My name is Emilia Vann Yaroson, and today I'll be going through getting started with research sampling and selecting samples. Once again, thank you for the opportunity to share my knowledge with everybody. Okay, so we'll just talk briefly about population and sample selection, the importance of sampling selection, types of sampling, and deciding on sample size. So let's start from the beginning. When you're doing your research, you will see that irrespective of is qualitative or kind of sample that you will need for your research, and it has to be aligned with your research question and research objective. What we find out is that most people just decide on a sample without considering what their research question is or their research objective is. So for example, if you want to look at the impact of COVID, let me use COVID since it's a more recent event, the impact of COVID on supply chain efficiency in a country in Africa, for example. Let's say Nigeria, since I'm from Nigeria, a country in Nigeria, for example, we are looking at the impact of COVID on supply chain efficiency. You will need to consider, so looking at that, you will need to consider what your sample is. First of all, you need to ask yourself the question of what supply chain do you want to look at? Who do you want to interview? How many people do you want to interview? How do you want to access these interviews? And so based on your research question and your research objective, you need to consider sampling. And that's why sampling is very important within research. So what we'll be talking about today in the next 45 minutes will be just starting with sampling. We'll go into details about the calculation aspects of it in quantitative research, but we will just go look at it from an overview. Sometimes it is possible to collect data from the entire population, or often referred to as a census, but in most cases it is not. I'll use the case of the impact of COVID on supply chain efficiency. And you say you take a country like Nigeria. Nigeria is a very broad country, and you as a researcher may not be able to collect all the information from all the supply chains within the whole country. You may not have access to everything. And that is why understanding the kind of sample you want and the sampling method is really important. Now, based on your research question and your research objective, you may be required to generalize findings or contribute to theory. And why sampling is important, very important. It's very, very important to consider sampling because it determines the accuracy of your research, especially if you are generalizing or contributing to theory. If you expect to make an impact, your sampling, because if there's a problem with your sampling, then with your results, you need to understand what kind of sample size that you are taking, what kind of sample. Are you asking the right questions from the right people to answer your research objective? So especially when the population is very large, you need to save time and money. So you need to know who you are asking and how you're asking the questions. So before we proceed, it's very important to understand the different definitions and different keywords and concepts. You realize that most students oftentimes confuse population versus sampling. Population means the entire member of the specific group of interest. So we are looking at a supply chain. So we're looking, for example, we're looking at the supply chain in Nigeria. So what supply chain? So if you want to look at the manufacturing supply chain, that would be the entire population of the manufacturing supply chain. So everybody, all the managers of it may not be all the managers, but all the stakeholders, the word here will be stakeholders, since you're looking at a supply chain, all members from that specific group of interest. So that is the population. Example will be healthcare workers. So if you want to look at maybe the impact of COVID on mental health, you look at healthcare workers or students studying a particular course, just depending on your research question and objective. That will determine who your population is and how you would determine your sample. So the difference between population and sample is that a sample is a subset of a population, and sampling, as I have indicated here, and sampling is the process of getting your sample. So that's basic key concept. So like I explained before, sampling is a technique or process of selecting a reasonably small number of elements from a predefined population And sample size refers to the number of participants or observations included in a study. So it's important to know the different key terms so that when you are making your decision in your sampling and your sampling process, you will be able to do that accurately. So in sampling, we have two basic types of sampling: probability sampling and non-probability sampling. Oftentimes, probability sampling is associated with quantitative research. So quantitative research is research that seeks to generalize and is based on facts, while qualitative is more subjective and you are contributing to theoretical contribution rather than generalization or inferences. In probability sampling, we have simple random sampling, systematic sampling, cluster sampling, and stratified sampling. In non-probability sampling, we have convenience sampling, snowballing sampling, purposive sampling, and quota sampling. I would explain this in detail shortly. So probability sampling, I've explained that it's oftentimes associated with quantitative research, or if your aim in your research is generalization. It's a process referred to as representative sampling, where you select the sample when you want to make statistical inferences about the population to meet your research objective and answer your research question. According to Saunders et al., there are 4 stages. One is decide the samples frame, that is your population, that is most suitable for your research. We'll continue to use the supply chain, the manufacturing supply chain, the impact of COVID as a disruption on the manufacturing supply chain, on the efficiency of the manufacturing supply chain in Nigeria. Decide the sample time frame. So the sample time frame will be the manufacturing industry in Nigeria. Find out the right sample size, right? So you need to understand what the sample size is. If you are using probability sampling, you would have to decide which of the samples that sampling method you want to use and what sample size will be effective for generalization. Then select the most appropriate sampling technique and then select the sample. Check that the sample is representative of the population. Most times, in checking the sample is representative of this population, often has to do with statistical techniques, associated statistical techniques for reliability and validity, which we will not go into detail today. So with simple random sampling, so remember I talked about probability sampling where there are different types of probability sampling. We'll start with simple random sampling. Like the name implies, it is simple random sampling. The whole idea of this is that every member of the population has an equal chance and likelihood of being selected. You can do that using ballot boxes or random numbers or just different. The whole idea is that every member of the population, so you can just randomly choose. So we'll use the manufacturing industry as an example. So you randomly choose and maybe you put all the companies, all the manufacturing firms within the manufacturing supply chain, you put them inside a box and you randomly pick out each who you are going to interview and things like that, or you use random numbers. Here, the whole idea is also to reduce bias. And there are some techniques also, some calculations also used to arrive at the sample size when using simple random sampling. Then we have probability. Another type of probability sampling is the systematic sampling. So it involves the selection of elements for a sample at every interval of the population. So the whole idea is that you collect your sample systematically, and it's based on a fraction that you arrive at, where you have the sample size, the population divided by the sample size. Whatever you want to get is called sampling fraction. So if you have like 50 manufacturing firms, and you want a sample size of 5, sorry. So it will be 50 divided by 5. So that will give you a fifth of the population. So for you to select your sample here, you do 1 in every 5. So you select 0, the first company will be 0, and then you select 1, then you select 5, then you select 10, like that, 1 in every 5, until you get your sample size. That is what systematic sampling is all about. Then we have cluster sampling. Cluster sampling is another type of probability sampling. In this technique, the population is divided into smaller groups, and they are termed clusters. So you can group your population based on clusters, and it's usually done based on geographical areas. For example, let's use the manufacturing firm, for example. You put them in clusters, maybe based on wherever they are located within the country. So maybe based on regions, you put them in samples. The whole idea is that they are in clusters, and based on that, you now can use random sampling to select each one from each region. So we have region A, B, C, D. Assuming it's a country like Nigeria, and their region A, B, C, D. And you have manufacturing firms that are located across these regions. What you do is that you cluster them based on the region, and then do a random sample to collect them. Or you can use random sampling or systematic sampling to pick each one from each region to arrive at your sample, your required sample. The whole idea is that everybody within the population would have a chance of being selected, but this will be based on clustering. So you put them in smaller groups, and then randomly or systematically select your sample. Then we have what's called stratified sample. So stratified sampling, is almost like cluster sampling. But the whole idea is that in cluster sampling, everybody is a mix of everybody within the population. So you can have big firms and small firms. So I'm still using the manufacturing supply chain, where you have big firms, you have small firms, you have medium firms. In clustering, everybody is within a cluster, and everybody is represented within the cluster. But in stratified sampling, people within the cluster are homogeneous. That means you only group small firms in one area, larger firms in another area, and medium firms in another area. So they are in these homogeneous groups are referred to as strata. So from there, you can now use random sampling or systematic sampling to randomly select your sample. But before you do that, you need to group them into homogeneous groups. These they have to be homogeneous, and you study them in exactly one stratum. Now, selecting your sample size in probability sampling actually differs from selecting your sample size in non-probability sampling. I think I explained this earlier, that when your research objective is to make inferences about the population. So if you want to say, for example, the whole of the entire manufacturing supply chain in Nigeria, COVID as a disruption affected the efficiency of the entire manufacturing chain, manufacturing supply chain. If you want to make that kind of inference, then you go towards probability sampling. But if you want to make contributions to theory, which I will explain in a bit detail later, then where you are looking at how COVID impacted on the manufacturing supply chain, you are trying to extend theory, how, the process of how, not the impact, then you use non-probability sampling. So if you want to generalize, so after collecting like maybe 50 responses from the entire population, from your sample is 50 from the entire manufacturing firm, and whatever your answer will say, 80% of them responded based on your statistical analysis, and you say 80% of them responded to the fact that COVID affected their efficiency, then you are generalizing, because you will say that indeed COVID affected the entire population, affected the entire supply chain's efficiency. So choosing a sample size, therefore, is determined by the confidence you have in your data. So if your aim is to generalize and you chose 50 people as your sample size, and you chose 50 and you are confident, those are actually based on statistical techniques as well, and you're confident in the data that you have and the responses. That's the level of certainty of your data, and the margin of error that you can tolerate. That has to also do with statistical techniques as well, and the type of analysis that you're going to undertake. You can now say that based on your sample size, sometimes, for example, if you use 50 and you use different statistical techniques, so we have correlations, we have regression techniques, we have structural equation modeling, we have different kinds of techniques that you use that are statistical in nature. If you use that and they give you their validity and reliability, tells you that yes, your sample size is representative of your population, then you can go ahead and generalize. But if you do these statistical techniques and it says your sample size is not representative of your population, then you need to either collect data or go collect more data, basically. So non-probability sampling. In the last couple of minutes, we've been talking about probability sampling, and we've talked about the various types of probability sampling. There are more, but these are the basic four. So we talked about random, we talked about clusters, stratified, and systematic. And the whole idea is if your aim is to generalize. Now, non-probability sampling is more subjective in nature. So there's a method in collecting probability sampling, while non-probability sampling is more subjective. So it's based on the researcher's judgment. So it's not randomly selected. It's also interesting important if the researcher has limited resources, time, and workforce and accessibility. Like I said, if your aim is not to achieve generalization, you can go for non-probability sampling, and is usually associated with qualitative research. So there are the various types of non-probability sampling. One will be convenience sampling. It's often used in qualitative research. Sometimes it's used in quantitative research as well. And like the name implies, it's based on convenience. Who is more accessible? Who is available to complete my questionnaire, or who is available for me to do an interview with? For example, if you're undergrad students, most of the time use their colleagues or classmates to complete their questionnaire or interviews, or complete their surveys and things like that. So if you're looking at the impact of maybe chatbot or customer satisfaction, and you know that everybody in class shops online, and you always come across chatbots and things like that. Instead of going far to look for people to complete your questionnaire, you can easily ask your friends and your colleagues, can you complete this questionnaire for me so that I can do my dissertation, or I can reach whatever I want to reach. So most times it's based on convenience, and you can send out a link on social media for people to complete the survey or things like that. So it's based on accessibility, convenience, and availability. No criteria is required to be part of the sample. However, it leaves room for bias, because sometimes you may not know if you are collecting the right data to answer your research question or achieve your research objective. And snowballing, as the name implies, is a snowball. So what happens here is that you recruit the first person or the first couple of people who you feel will be able to give you the questions or answer your questions correctly. And they will now recruit more people. Like I gave an example here is, for example, if you are doing research on rare diseases or a rare blood disease, for example, what snowballing does is that if you are able to recruit 1 or 2 people, because of the peculiarity of the disease, not so many people will want to talk to a researcher about it. So what you would do is that you recruit 1 person, that person has talked to you and feels confident about relating or answering your questions. They will now recruit more people that will help you answer your research question. So it involves the research participants or the research respondents that recruits your participants for you. And so it's based on the actual sample size, maybe just based on who you are able to recruit, not a set defined number of people, as compared to if you're using probability sampling, where you're looking for a set defined number of people. Now, for purposive sampling is also known as judgment sampling. This is because it's based on the researcher's judgments. Now, the researcher needs to seek for people who will give you the required information that you need, or the required data that you need to answer your research question. So these respondents have particular characteristics, and so you need to seek them carefully. For example, when I was doing my research on the use of resilience strategies in reducing medicine shortages, not every manager will know what resilience strategy is. So you need to look for managers, like you need to carefully look for those managers to find out who they are and make sure they are knowledgeable on the use of these strategies, so that they would give you the information that you require. In non-probability sampling, the issue about sample size differs because it's not about making inferences, but about answering your research question. So there are no rules. Contribution is made to theory, but not generalization about the population. So in getting your sample size, it has to do with data saturation rather than getting a specified number of people to complete your question or your survey or things like that. So it has to do with data saturation. So you keep collecting information from different people until no new information is coming forth. So you keep on collecting information from from more respondents until no new info. When you see that people are saying the same thing over and over again, that means you've reached what we call data saturation and you do not keep collecting data. That has to do with most issues with non-probability sampling. I think I've come to the end of this. These are some of the references that I use. Thank you. I made it short because I would like to know what people want to ask and answer.
Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. It was very, very insightful, enlightening, and informative as well. Thank you for sharing your knowledge. So I'm going to give the platform to our audience to ask any questions that they might be having at the moment. You can just interact with our speaker. If you have any question, please unmute yourself and ask your question. Thank you.
Good day, good afternoon, or is it good evening? No, good afternoon. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
There are usually these questions, two of them, which normally would disturb somebody who is collecting data. Like in a topic, you find somebody coming out with the impact of X on Y. That's one. Another one is the influence of something on the other one. So given those, or how this one affect the other one, given those areas, which one would it be very easy to just say, if you are looking for impact, like you have mentioned, or if you look for how the influence is coming up, would you be able to say, this one, I will advise the gentleman or the lady to go probably sampling, whatever or sampling, or how? Just for guidance only. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question. So usually when you are looking for impact, so you're looking for the impact of something on another, that means you want to measure. So that is quantitative. Impact and influence are almost interchangeable in words, especially when you use the word what is, right? That means you want to measure. As long as it's measurable, then it's quantitative. And if it's quantitative, you go for probability sampling. Does it make any sense? You go for probability sampling. Now, when you're going for probability sampling, you can now decide based on the type of population and the question that you are going to ask. You can now decide if you want to do a simple random sampling or you want to do cluster or stratified or systematic. It just depends on you. But in most cases, if you are doing quantitative research, you would always go for probability sampling because you want to measure, and your aim at measuring is generalization, making statistical inferences. I hope I've been able to answer that question.
I want to share that you have answered it very well, because this is one of the questions which I know the answer would be the same way, but most of the students, like I teach research methods or such applied research, you find that those questions, sometimes they get mixed up. And thank you very much for those who are listening, who are also same people whom we have shared platform with. I think that question was well answered. Thank you very much for that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, I see there's a hand from P. Delis. You may unmute yourself and ask your question, please.
Okay, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
And thank you very much for your insightful presentation. Please, I would like to know if I am using simple random sampling and I have a sample frame and I use a lottery method to choose the participants. In providing justification for the sample size, do I still have to state a any formula for agreeing or for choosing that sample size?
Okay, so you have to do, thank you so much for your question, Fidelis. So if
You're
you're doing
welcome.
lottery, you use the lottery process, but by the
Yes.
time you do your statistical analysis, for example, you use, if you're doing a regression or something like that, it says that when you use your analysis, it will show you if your sample size was representative of the population or not. If it is not, then you need to give us justification why the lottery method that you have used you think was the most suitable. You need to give us supported by academic sources, why you think the lottery method that you have used. So if you use the lottery method and you use your statistical techniques and you see that it is representative of the sample, then you are justified. You supply the reader or the whoever with that. But if it is not, you need to justify why you think this lottery method that you have used is sufficient for you. You need to always justify that. I don't know if it makes any sense.
Thank you. Please, follow-up question.
Okay.
Is there an instance that I can state in my research that I use simple random sampling, but in determining the sample size, I use a Yamunan or Craig and Morgan sample size determination
Selection
table? Yes, please.
Yes, you can do that.
I can provide that.
Yes, you can provide that as your evidence. So that's a statistical technique that you can provide as evidence. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I can see we have Mbusi Mkize. Mbusi, you may take yourself off mute and then ask your question.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, okay, thanks a lot, Emilia, and then good day, colleagues. On my side, I just want to get clarity. Okay, when you're using a quantitative research methodology, and then you want to use the non-experimental research or descriptive method within that quantitative method, but on my research that I'm doing now currently, I'll be checking the sample will be the companies within a certain province in South Africa. And then within those companies, they say KZN, I'll be selecting the sample from people within the procurement or supply chain environment. So that one should be a proper for me if I'm using a clustering sampling type, because I'm not going to select all the companies, but I'll be selecting certain companies within a region. And then within that, companies are selecting a selective or a typical or a similar group of people to form a sample for my research. So the cluster sample will be the proper one to use in that instance.
Sorry, if I can, thank you so much for your question, but if I can get the question, you said you would like to know, you're using quantitative techniques and you like to know the proper sample size in achieving that?
Yes,
sorry,
I just like to know.
that.
Yes, I like to know if the cluster sampling would be the proper one to use if I'm using the geographic or a region to select. Yes, and then from within region, I'll select few companies, and then within those companies, I'll select a supply chain or procurement. Yes, so
so especially if they are geographically dispersed, the cluster sampling would help you reduce them. So what it does, it helps you reduce the population into clusters. So the cluster now becomes your sample frame, and then you can now use that in selecting your you can now do a simple random sampling in selecting your sample.
Okay. No problem. Thanks. I just want to make sure that I understand the difference between the cluster sampling and then after that use a random sampling. Okay.
Random sampling,
thanks a
lot. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that question. I can see there's that's a one you are on, you unmuted yourself. Do you want to say something perhaps?
Oh, sorry, it was a mistake. Sorry.
Okay. Is there anyone who would like to ask a question in the audience? You can just unmute yourself and ask anything that you'd like to ask. Okay, I can see Fidelis is on. You can just say your question.
Okay, once again, under what circumstances can I use quota sampling, taking into consideration the population, please?
Quota sampling also is a non-probability kind of sampling. And then under, especially if it's subjective, if your whatever you are doing, your research question or your research objective is subjective in nature, if it's subjective, then you go for quota sampling. So it's almost like quota sampling is almost like cluster and stratified sampling, only that this in this case is non-probability. So when you're getting your quota, you are not using any systematic method in getting the number of people that you want to interview or you want to collect data from. So if your aim is not generalization, you can go for quota sampling. But if your aim is generalization and you are going to use statistical techniques, then you go for stratified sampling. I hope I've answered your question.
Thank you. Yes, please. I got it now.
Okay.
Thank you for that question. Anyone? Okay, I would take silence as as satisfaction. So I believe that everyone is it's satisfied with the answers of the questions that they have asked, and as well as the presentation as a whole. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank you so much for being with us today, Dr. Emilia. And I believe that even in the future, you are open to working together with us, so that we'll discuss later on. But I just hope that even in the future, you'll have open arms to work together with us and to grow ISCA as a nonprofit organization. And also for those who are always with us, you know that we're going to have another session which will take place in 2 weeks on the 4th of August. We're going to have a session with Prof. Arthur Ahimbi-Sibye. So please avail yourself for next week's session. And I hope it's going to be as informative as this one. Before we go, I would like for you, my beautiful audience, to please follow us on our social media platforms. We are African Institute for Supply Chain Research on all our social media platforms. We do have YouTube, Twitter, LinkedIn, as well as Facebook. That's where you can get more information about our upcoming programs, as well as the recording links for this kind of sessions. So please follow us on all our social media platforms. And until we meet again in 2 weeks, please have a blessed afternoon further. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thanks, Ola. Have a lovely day.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.